We know that he murdered her. We don't know why. We don't need to know why.
He was a liar. Nothing he said in those stories were true. He was a coward to the day that he died.
I think coward is a very good description for Brian, and cowardice the way that Brian, in a way, lived his life. Part of the mandate, or what I think should be the mandate of a true crime channel, is to find out the why. Why is hard. It means we've got to get to know people, and that takes time. It means we have to understand the complex fabric of a case, the context, the dynamics, the timelines, all the evidence, and integrate it. And that takes time. Unlike Gabby's mom, I think it behoves us to know why. Why do you think that is? Well, so that future Brians can learn how not to be douchebags, or how douchebags are made. And future Gabbys can perhaps make different choices, including recognizing douchebags or recognizing being in a untenable situation. I think there are also lessons for parents, police, close friends in recognizing certain patterns, and I think what this whole case demonstrates is actually how bad all of us are at subtlety.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science. Hope you guys are having a good weekend. Now, subtlety is the opposite of being hit over the head with something. Some people, when they've been subtled, don't know what hit them. And I would argue, in a sense, the subtleties in this case, obvious as they are, still elude many people. I must say another case that is like that is the John Benet Ramsey case. There are subtleties in that case that seem to confuse so many people, and yet it's not that subtle. In this analysis, we're going to be dealing with three new insights via the perspective of subtlety. You might say, none of this is new, or that none of it is anything I didn't know. But knowing about something and knowing what it means are subtle differences. Knowing about something and knowing how to interpret it is different. It's a different perspective. And subtlety is details. Details are subtle. There's a lot of subtlety in nature, a lot of details in nature. And knowing how to act on these details is the difference between effective living and dysfunction. Before we get to the rest of this analysis, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. By the way, according to my analytics, most of you aren't subscribed, almost 60%. So please do subscribe. If you're finding this analysis worthwhile, please hit the thanks button and let's get started. Right, so number one, are you dating Brian?
We would ask her, are you dating Brian? Are you not dating Brian? She was like, no, we're just friends.
One does have to ask why Gabby sort of kept Brian a secret. And I think one answer is that it might simply be in her nature. Some people just like to play their cards close to their chests. But I think there's more to it than this, more subtlety to it than that. I do think despite Brian's obvious attraction to Gabby, his obvious infatuation with Gabby, his obvious interest in Gabby, Gabby was hesitant. Gabby was uncertain. Gabby was cautious. And you know what? She was right to be.
Guys, 2019.
One day, Gabby came to me and asked what I thought of her moving to Florida with Brian. I remember saying to her, well, I guess you guys are a thing now. She really hadn't come out and said, we're definitely dating. So she said, yeah, Mom, we're dating. He's my boyfriend. And I was like, it's kind of quick, are you sure?
The next day she was down in Florida.
Now, think about what we're dealing with here. It's a double quick. It's not just we dating, it's also I'm heading off with someone you don't know, which means Gabby didn't know him either. But basically what's happening is things are moving quite quickly. And at the end of the day, it was this not knowing Brian that we're sitting with today. And by the same token, Brian, who didn't like Gabby working, didn't like the blog, didn't like the vlog, didn't think the vlog would work, Well, maybe that's something you want to talk about before you set off on the road with an influencer or as an influencer. And so when Gabby told him, I want to be a solo traveler, Brian probably also felt, wow, I don't know this person. Well, do you know why you didn't, Brian? Because you were too busy making moves, acting fast, and there was too little trying to get to know her and allowing her to get to know you. And implicit in any rush to move a relationship from A to B is, I think, the implicit threat that if you took your time, if you really knew who you were dealing with, well, you would run for the hills, right? Moving fast means a certain amount of buy-in and gaslighting, which confuses that whole process. In other words, the subtle aspect is lost, and some of that is intentional. I also think the whole trip to Florida, sudden, some might say rash, was something that Brian got away with, which set the tone for the next rash step, getting engaged. And think about it, that also caught everyone by surprise. And if you think about it, Gabby basically ended up withdrawing from that lock-in over time. She kind of had second thoughts, only to find out who Brian really was when she tried to do that, when she tried to withdraw. Number 2, Gabby's Nissan.
Gabby had a little Nissan Sentra. I was like, you're going to drive that car all the way down there?
Well, no, Brian was going to drive Gabby's car. And guess what? In the end, Brian kills Gabby and does it again. Drives her car all the way home and sees nothing wrong with that as well. What did Gabby see in Brian? I think at 21, 22, she had an idealistic view of life, pure in a sense, but also naive. That's something I also want to talk about in more detail, not here, but at some point. Gabby's politics, Brian's politics, but not so much the actual politics, but their view of the world, their sort of perspective on how the world should sort of be. And so Brian's psychology seemed to be sort of giving Gabby everything she wanted. And I guess from Gabby's perspective, she had Brian wrapped around her little finger. And maybe Gabby liked that. And maybe Gabby thought that that was true love. That's what true love looked like and felt like. And Gabby was also giving Brian everything he wanted. But a person can never be the basis for the experience of life. Only life can be.
Oh my god, this is gonna be so much fun. I love that we have no obligation.
Oh, no obligations whatsoever.
Yeah.
It's like living a dream.
Except they were about to tie each other in massive obligations to each other. Obligations that would ultimately cost both of them their lives. And of course, for most human beings on this planet, at some point, one has to make a living, get a job, put in some effort. When Gabby realized this and started doing this, Brian didn't like it. Anyone who wants to take you to no obligations Pleasure Island, like the fox leading Pinocchio, is not only not to be trusted, but likely too good to be true. Gabby's Pleasure Island with Brian, at least from my perspective, and at least to begin with, seemed to be about not needing to work, smoking dope, having sex, driving around wherever you wanted to, hiking and camping and roasting marshmallows over a campfire. All that is good and well, but real life isn't Pleasure Island, and what Gabby and Brian were really doing wasn't so much living life, but avoiding life, fleeing from life, escaping life, which is why anxiety was catching up with both of them, and why neither had the resources, the armor, the experience, or the maturity to deal with life because they'd had so little practice. And no one is saying that young people shouldn't enjoy themselves a little bit. Of course you should when you're young, just that you can't stay on Pleasure Island forever. You can't make a life out of Pleasure Island. And so when the Moab stop happens, you have two individuals that can't be honest with themselves. They can't be honest with each other. They can't be honest with the authorities. Gabby also doesn't tell her mother everything that happened. Why? Because all she knows is Pleasure Island, and she doesn't want it to end.
But, as you well know, appearances can be deceiving.
Yes, Pleasure Island, as we all know, is a not-so-subtle nightmare when all your life is Pleasure Island and nothing else. And you might find, as Gabby did, Pleasure Island can also be a one-way trip. When you choose to finally leave, someone else might decide They can't have that. They need you on their pleasure island in order to have their pleasure island. So much for no obligations whatsoever, and dreams becoming an anxiety-ridden nightmare. And that brings us to number 3, fleeing the scene. Another prescient precursor to the horror, to the tragic horror about to unfold. I mean, Gabby died about 2 weeks after the Moab incident. Brian became this murderous SOB. From the smiling dude, he became what he became. Well, he was already that person in a sense. And think about what we see in the opening seconds of the Netflix series. Do you know what's actually happening? A cop car is pursuing the van. Brian is speeded up and literally seems to be running away from what he's just done. And I've driven on that road quite a few times myself. We possibly need to talk about that just the road and where all of this happened. But inside the van, when the officer approaches Gabby, what does he see? Gabby's crying. Gabby had been shouting at him, shouting at Brian, hitting his arm, trying to get this idiotic individual to make a rational decision. And so when he finally stops, he almost hits the curb, and the officer even cries out in surprise.
Oh, no obligations whatsoever.
Yeah.
It's like,
And consider that statement, no obligations whatsoever, in the context to the laundries. When the police come knocking at their door, we've got no obligations towards Gabby. We don't need to tell you anything. We're not obliged to do anything. But if we turn back time and go back to the Moab stop, and how it starts is someone calls 911 and the vehicle is pursuing the van, and the van is actually driving at speed, seemingly away from this vehicle, law enforcement vehicle. And I think this is a basic aspect law enforcement seems to miss. You know, Brian didn't seem to honestly want to allow himself to face the music. And of course he didn't. He faced it dishonestly and only because he had to. After murdering Gabby, he went on the run twice, firstly fleeing the scene and then slipping out of his parents' home and skulking into Maikahachi. And when it came time for Brian to face his own music, he couldn't even do that because in his entire life he hadn't. Even when Brian got engaged to Gabby, he didn't even have a ring. He didn't even feel obligated in that sense. Now, although as adults Gabby and Brian were responsible for their lack of responsibilities, given that they were young adults, one expects a little more responsibility perhaps from both sets of parents. We can see how the laundries also avoided responsibility when it came knocking at their door. But shouldn't the Petitos have been a little more responsible with following up with their daughter as well? What do you guys think? And I mean, this is not to point a finger as much as to own up to the question, in what areas are we in denial? In what areas are we shirking obligations? In what areas are we cutting corners? In what areas are we impatient to cheat the process of getting to know something or someone that we really ought to go about doing slowly and carefully? In what areas do we have obligations that we're not owning up to? You know, we're at the beginning of this year, 2025. Now might be a good time to just pause on that thought and consider it carefully and soberly. Well, I hope you will, and I hope this will help you. I'm not going to take it further than that. I will be continuing this analysis over the course of the next week or two. For those interested in the Ramsey case, the next episode will deal with the housekeeper's husband. So look out for that. Thank you for listening. I hope you're having a great weekend, and I'll see you guys next time.